You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You're listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Today is one of my very special sorts of episodes, if that's the right way to say it, where we get an R and a D together and they talk about their friendship and the fun times they've had together over their careers. The Republican is Toby McClamroch, who's been an immense help to my career in more ways that I could ever repay him. He's been absolutely terrific, and Toby, I'm grateful. He has held numerous positions. He's been a member of the Indianapolis City County Council. He's been parliamentarian for the Indiana House of Representatives. He's been the attorney for the Indiana House of Representatives. He's worked at the Catholic Community Foundation. The list goes on, including a stint as chairman of the Marion County Election Board, which I did not know until I looked up your bio. The Democrat and his good friend is John Dillon. John, I'd have to say, has always had the greatest attitude in terms of what's best for the city. Let's all work together, and we can play our partisan games if we have to. But, okay, this is the best thing for the city, and that's what we're going to do. And that's one of the things that I learned from him more than 20 years ago at this point.
It's a good way to say it, by the way.
He served as Mayor Bart Peterson's chief of staff. He was also insurance commissioner for the state of Indiana, and he was director of the Hoosier Lottery. That's the second Hoosier Lottery director we've had on, because I interviewed Sarah Taylor about a year ago. Thank you both, Toby and John, for coming on the podcast.
It's nice to be here.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure.
So first off, you are both DePaul grads. So Lauren Mills and John Hammond, and let's see, Hillary Egan, and who else do we have who are all DePaul grads around here?
Well, there are a lot. John Hammond's at the top, right? John was a year older than me at DePaul. I always looked up to John. He was a big deal on campus, big man on campus. Remember the Gold Club and all kinds of things. John was a big deal. And if you recall, he graduated immediately, went to work for Governor Orr, right? As Lieutenant Governor Orr, I think.
Yeah.
At the time. So, yeah, John was a big deal.
Then Dr. Joel Hammond was John's brother and my fraternity brother.
Oh, really?
Absolutely. And a surgeon who lives in St. Louis now. Still stay in contact with him.
So what else? That's that. Ken Owen, did he go to
Ken Owen's class of 82 as well.
I guess we should mention Dan Quayle.
Dan Quayle.
Who else? And when did you?
Sue-Ann Gilroy.
But you two were not at DePaul at the same time.
We were not.
I graduated in 77. John was 82.
How did you all meet?
Robert, we were laughing about that this morning. We can't really figure it out. Toby thinks he knows.
We went to the same church. We went to St. Luke Catholic Church, and John, we intersected there. What I really remember are a couple of things, one of which is when our son was born, we signed him up to be baptized in the narthex at St. Luke. So we're there getting ready for the baptism. We're the only family in there. And suddenly here comes the Dillon family, and so with their son Bob. And so Bob and our son Bill were baptized together, just the two families there. And the great thing about that story is that Bob and Bill became best friends, and our son Bill just got married last summer, and Bob was in his wedding, and Bob just got married about a month ago, and Bill was in his wedding, and they literally went to St. Luke together. They went to Brebeuf together. They went to DePaul together. They played sports together.
Fraternity brothers together.
Fraternity
Roommates.
brothers.
Where'd they go to college?
DePaul.
I almost committed. Well, I did commit a grievous error, which I am now rectifying in the panoply of DePaul legends. I did not mention Denny Sutherland. Denny, I am so sorry.
Thank you for mentioning that, because he would be calling us if we hadn't got it.
He'll be calling anyway.
He would be calling anyway. So, true or false, there is such a thing as a Brebeuf Mafia?
100% absolutely correct.
Well, I didn't go to Brebeuf. I went to Crawfordsville High School, so I'm not a Brebeuf guy. But
You wrote some checks.
our son, Bill, went to Brebeuf, and I have to tell you, it was a great experience. So, but it's been with some amount of envy that I've watched John and his posse from Brebeuf hang out together over the years.
Robert, I would tell you that
Because Glass didn't deny it either, Fred Glass.
it's absolutely correct. But I would tell you that Brebeuf is the finest high school in Indiana. I may argue in the Midwest. I track very closely our graduates coming out of college, and the performance and where they're going and the professions they're going into is nationwide, unbelievable. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, and I all credit Brebeuf for giving them their base to do that.
What was it like, just to kind of wrap up this Brebeuf thing, is when Alan Henderson was there and they were so good at basketball? Did it kind of come out of nowhere? Did you have a good relationship with him and his family? Like his dad was a doctor, Alan Henderson's dad?
Well, and Mrs. Henderson was the genesis behind the relationship with Brebeuf, and just was a wonderful lady. And Alan's still involved today as a child there. But where Alan went, some of his posse followed him, and we lost one game. It was the state finals game. So he was fantastic, and has been a great contributor to the school.
You've been involved in a lot, both of you. I want to ask you about this because then I want to pivot into a quick conversation about Rex Early. You both have been heavily involved in CYO and Catholic charities and organizations. There seems to be, I mean, as a Catholic myself, there seems to be a terrific Catholic close-knit community in Indianapolis. Toby and then John, talk about that. Is that your experience as well?
No, that's right. There's no question about it. I mean, CYO itself is a great organization, right? And it's like any organization where you have parents involved. And it was, for me, the opportunity to coach my daughters and our son, Bill, in different sports. I mean, you just meet a lot of people, right? Changing the subject only slightly, I just have to tell you my favorite John Dillon story because it relates to coaching, which is I was coaching my son in basketball when he was 6 years old, and John was coaching his son, Bob, when he was 7 years old, and we were playing against each other. We coached against each other numerous times, and I could there aren't as many John Dillon stories as there are Rex Early stories, but there are a lot of John Dillon stories. So at the end of the third quarter, when my son is 6, we hadn't scored a point yet at the end of the third quarter. So I've got my kids in the huddle, and I'm trying to say, hey, we got to do this or that. John comes into our huddle, the opposing coach, and says, in the history of this organization, boys, there's never been a Schneid. Good luck.
And?
That was it. He walked out of the huddle. And we scored. Oh, we scored. We scored.
We won 32-2. And I had my kids run sprints for giving up the 2 points every game.
They were pressing. They had the press on, right, when it's 32-0. But
talk about the Catholic community here in Indianapolis. I know
it's
you're
very
heavily
interesting.
involved.
I was very heavily involved with CYO. I think it's one of the finest organizations in town. It's interesting that when you go on to the field of play, court of play, it is very serious competition, and everybody's trying to win. And at the end of it, when you walk off, everybody realizes, hey, it's over, let's move on. And obviously we've got family and friends all around the city. But I think it develops character, and I think it developed leadership of kids coming through it and a competitive spirit. And I think you see that in a lot of the private schools in town.
That's well said.
We talk a little bit before I want to ask about Rex Early, but I only can append to that by saying when I was in graduate school, I refereed basketball, high school, AAU, industrial leagues, whatever. They actually, the CYO, I think, is the one who pays for the referees, right? Mm-hmm. They paid me 100% more per game because they could not find anyone to referee CYO on the east side of Indianapolis. Because people would say, I'm not going there. So they called me and they said, hey, what about if we pay you more east side? I'm like, I live on the east side. I was living with Chris Sullivan at the time. Mm-hmm. And I got paid extra because everyone was so scared of the east side families. And the very first technical I ever threw in CYO was to my good friend, our good friend, Tom O'Donnell. I said, Tom, if you don't shut up, I've known you since I'm 5 years old, but you're going to get a technical. And he's growling. And
that wasn't Tommy's first technical.
No, I don't think it was.
Nor was it his last.
Another great East Side Catholic and citizen of Indianapolis, Tom O'Donnell. He's wonderful. We recorded a podcast about the memory of Rex Early. I had a column in the Indianapolis Star about it. Both of you have known him for a long time, especially John. John, let's go to you first. He was very active in the CYO and a lot of things. Give us your thoughts on Rex.
It's an interesting story. My father, Jack Dillon, and Rex were very, very close. Different political parties, but we're extremely close friends. And Rex had left a note and talked to Pat about it and said, you know, if I ever go down, these are who I want my pallbearers to be. Mm-hmm. And every one of his pallbearers had passed away. So Rex said in his last couple of weeks, hey, Jim Clark's my great friend, but I love Murray, and Darrell French was my great friend, and I love Ed French, and Jack Dillon were great friends, and I love John. Have the boys be my pallbearers. So it was really a tremendous honor for me, frankly.
Yeah.
Grew up with the Earlys. Pat and I have been friends since kids, and he was one of a kind, and that, unfortunately, generation is quickly fading, and that type of character, unfortunately, is quickly fading as well.
Let me ask a question, and then I want to get you on this too, Toby. And you're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast with John Dillon and his friend, Toby McClamroch. It seems to me that the people who get most upset about politics are the people who aren't in it. Is that a fair statement, John? And then Toby, because a bunch of my friends will argue about it all day long. And then, just yesterday I had lunch, Michael, Brian, Kip, too, Ed Tracy, and me. Like, if you're involved in politics and you know that the other side's got good people and that it's not all what you read on social media, I just wish more people would get involved so they could see and witness that dynamic.
Well, I think that's very accurate. Robert and Toby and I were talking. As a matter of fact, I think you lost the at-large bid in '99. And I would tell you, my crowd was kind of for Toby because he's practical, he's smart, you could deal with him. And once you're involved and you realize the person has character and they understand what's happening, things move smoothly. And when people aren't involved and don't have a clue, that's when the water gets rough. And I promote my kids to be involved and work a precinct and understand what's happening. And I just think it's helpful to understand the system and don't argue against something you don't get. So
right. Don't let the atmosphere poison you because it can be a whole lot different.
100%.
Yeah, when I think about Rex Early, I mean, most people think about Indiana Week in Review, the fact that he ran for governor in 1996. I mean, I think about Rex because for decades he was the Marion County Center Township Republican chair, which was, I mean, Rex was heavily involved in politics, right, from the beginning. I mean, he started as a state representative, I think, in 1962, right? And so Rex was always heavily involved. And, it's interesting what you just said, Robert, because I think maybe from that experience, it's actually a very interesting comment by you. in the sense that Rex had a level of respect for people, Republicans or Democrats. He didn't really care, right? And it's an interesting observation. I mean, I would draw the parallel with Joe Hogsett, right? Joe Hogsett, he's a Democrat, I'm a Republican. But it is not insignificant that Joe has passed all these budgets with almost unanimous support from the council. Because I can tell you, when I was on the city county council, we never, ever had anything but partisan votes for the budget. I mean, maybe I'm missing a couple of votes in my memory, but for the most part, they were very partisan. And so it's not insignificant. I mean, look, Joe Hogsett treats people with respect, right? And I think that's a foundation for making things happen in government, right? So it's an interesting observation. And the more heavily involved maybe you are in politics, the more respectful you are.
You were in on the Indianapolis Marion County City County Council from 1992 to 1999. But what is your first, and I'll ask you too, John, what's your first political memory?
Well, my first political memory
is there a presidential election, or is it this, or it's that?
I can actually just barely remember in 1960 my father taking me to an election night to Republican headquarters and seeing a banner with Richard Nixon's. So that's, I mean, that wasn't political involvement, but I can just barely remember that when I was a little kid. But I started out in the same Republican organization that Rex was involved in. I graduated from law school in 1980 and immediately became a Republican precinct committeeman. And so at that time in the 1980s, the Republican Party in Indianapolis was pretty strong. And I viewed that precinct involvement as meaningful, right? And it was the other precinct committeemen were, Murray Clark and Bob Grand and Mike Pence, and just a lot of young people were involved in the party. And it was social, right? It was a good way to be involved and contribute, but at the same time, it was social.
Do you remember the Kennedy assassination? Very well. JFK, obviously.
Yeah, 1960, November of 1963. I was in third grade, and that was or second grade. But yeah,
John, what's your first political memory?
When I was in third grade, when my father lost for his reelection bid for Attorney General, and I remember it.
What year?
1968. Mm-hmm. He got rolled up, although he led the state ticket, interesting enough, but got rolled up in the landslide for Nixon, I believe, at that point in time. And I'll never forget that. But he had a relationship, and I remember this, Robert, today when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. My father, because he was Attorney General at that time, had developed a relationship with Robert Kennedy, and was a huge. I mean, they were actually pretty close, and it was a crushing blow to our family. But I remember that in third grade when he lost.
Were you both predestined to be, Mike Riley came on the podcast, who ran that campaign in 1968. He was terrific. Rest in peace, Mike. Were you both predestined to be a member of your current political party? In other words, dads are D's, so you're D's or R's, or did you think that there was some sort of
Robert,
compact?
That's a great question. I've thought about that a lot. My father was I grew up on a farm north of Crawfordsville, and my father was heavily involved in Republican politics in Montgomery County, was on the county council for many years. And I think that what happens is initially you are connected to the party of your parents, right? I do think there's that connection. But I mean, in today's world, maybe it's there's some things that make it difficult to be a Republican right now. But the reality is I still believe in, limited government and lower taxes, less regulation. I believe in capitalism, right? So I'm a Republican. And I think as you get older, then as the years go by, you really identify with the party of your beliefs, right? And not so much who your parents were.
Coming up with my father involvement, he was very much so a civil rights activist. At the same time, was a fiscal conservative. So I kind of grew up fiscal conservative, but leaning a little bit to the left on social issues that I had watched him go through for the years. You know, he grew up on Holmes Avenue out in Hallville, youngest of 7 kids, and his dad died when he was 9. So I would tell you that he had to work very hard to get where he was and demanded that from us, but was a very quiet moderate, which made me a very quiet moderate, but raised in a Democratic family. And fortunately, as I grew up, I knew a lot of the Democratic families I came up with. So
I should have asked. I think I did maybe when Kip and Murray Clark were on, Kip 2 and Murray Clark, that Murray had an interesting dynamic considering his maternal grandfather was chairman of the Democratic National Committee under
no question.
Harry Truman. I'm like, what did you? He goes, He goes, I've always been a Republican. Do you remember the first time, like the first instance where you guys worked together? So you knew each other from the baptism and, you know, your families grew up, but given your career in politics, Toby, and yours, John, did you say, well, look, we can get some stuff done?
Let me tell you a quick story, Robert. This is really the first time that I engaged, maybe adverse to John. And you mentioned this a few minutes ago. So through my party involvement, I had different positions. One of those was that I served as the chair of the Marion County Election Board. And our attorney for the Marion County Election Board was J. Murray Clark. And I can't overstate the significance of 1990, what happened in 1990, which is that Jeff Modisett defeated Drew Young for Marion County prosecutor, which was shocking. And election night, so Faye Mowry was the county clerk, and she ran the election board, and we did it in conjunction with Faye. So Faye, Murray, myself were in her office. It's about 10 o'clock at night, and it's apparent that this election is my recollection is that Jeff was slightly ahead. And when I say slightly, I mean by like 50 votes.
Yeah, it was super close. Yeah.
So, you know, I think Murray and I we were thinking about, you know, there's going to be a recount. What do we need to do with the ballots? Those kinds of issues. We walk out in the hallway of the west wing of this city-county building, and John Dillon had assembled a team of about 30 lawyers who were standing. I'll never forget. We walk out and we see this group, and we were shocked. And it was, you know, it was Frank Sullivan and John Dillon and David Hamilton, all these people that went on, you know, Supreme Court, you know, Seventh Circuit, right? And they're all standing there ready to do battle with Murray and me. And I said, Murray, I think we're in trouble, right? And so, but what we did, this goes to John's point. What we did is that evening, right, we sat down and hammered out a compromise in terms of what we do with the ballots, you know, when do we start the process, because there's clearly going to be a recount, right?
There probably hadn't been a close race in Marion County for a long time.
Not like that.
In the general, I could see in a primary, but not in a general. Yeah, absolutely.
Robert, this was shocking, right? This is the first Democrat that won a countywide race, I'm going to say since 74. I may be wrong about that, but this was surprising, right? But my point is that working together, we worked this out. Now, I think Drew Young was disappointed with the result, and some of the people around Drew were disappointed with the result. But, you know, we had a good process, right? And John and I worked together on that process.
I should mention that Drew Young ended up being chairman of the election board. And I never had the opportunity to serve with him when I was running the elections. But I want to mention another great family. Since we've talked about you, John, a little bit, and obviously Toby and Rex, how long have you known the Eicholtzes, John?
Oh, since I was a child. Pat, Early, Ricky, and I go all the way back to 8 years old, probably, in that era. But I wanted to comment. Frank Sullivan was our leader on the recount, and the governor, who is obviously my political leader, and Joe Hogsett, political leader, saw the opportunity for the first time we could break into Marion County, and the governor said, Frank, get this together, get these guys. And Frank came over Ed Delaney was there. Best recount lawyer in the state of Indiana, Larry Rubin, God rest his soul.
God rest his soul. What a great guy.
He was in the middle of it, and it was our opportunity. And Toby, I don't know the exact timing, but it might have been 74 for the Democrats to actually win. And, by the way, the Young family, one of the great families in the city, were all dear friends of mine, so it was very difficult to go into this. Julie Young-Terrell wanted to kill me at that point in time. But
well, let me ask a question just basically on that. And before I move on, I have just discovered another DePaul alumna in my brain, and that is Deborah Daniels. Did either of you go to DePaul with her?
Not I.
I can't. The answer is no. I think Deborah graduated just before I arrived at DePaul. I think she graduated in 73. I think that's correct. I'm not sure.
You know, we've had podcasts. We've had Murray. We've had Kip, Robin Winston, Mike McDaniel. And the reason I bring those four people up especially is because they do a lot of media stuff we're used to. And the question that I always ask them is, how did you maintain your friendships with Republicans or Democrats if Republicans or Democrats gave you a hard time about it? Was there ever a time where someone came up to you and said, why are you being so nice to him? Like, or her, that kind of thing. I won't repeat Ed Tracy's answer because we don't curse on the Leaders and Legends podcast. But let me ask you, and this is a great question for Murray, because Murray was close to you, close to the Eichholzes, all these Democratic families, and here he is, my boss. He's chairman of the Indiana Republican Party. How do you handle that if there's ever like an issue?
Well, I think you maintain what the country's lacking right now, which is civility and decorum. And obviously, I have the utmost respect for Murray, and I think it's mutual. And once you approach it that way, I know where he's coming from. He knows where I'm coming from. Robert, we're both playing to win,
right?
But we're going to do it in a matter of civility.
Toby?
I think the state of Indiana is unique from a political standpoint. I think there's a level of civility in Indiana politics in general. There are a lot of exceptions to that,
sure.
Right? Look at Eric Holcomb. He treats everybody with respect, right?
Very practical governor.
Very practical, right? So I think from a general standpoint, I think there is a deep level of respect, and I think we're unique. Certainly different, as John just said, from what happens on the federal level.
Well, let me add a pin to that, please. I'm going to take you back. You may not remember this, but I do because it stuck with me. You and I was comms director at State Party, working for Jennifer Hollowell, working for Murray Clark, a job that you helped me get, by the way, and don't say you didn't because you did. And you and I are having lunch at Nordstrom when it was downtown. And we were talking about Watergate and politics and history, all the things we talked about. And you said to me, and I remember this very well, you said, people say all politics is local. I don't believe that. All politics is national. And at the time, I was like, well, okay, I see what your point is. Now, I'm completely convinced that through social media, all politics is national. Would you like to talk about that? Then we'll let John either agree or disagree.
Well, I intended that comment. I do think it's accurate, right? I don't think all politics are national, but I think that in today's world of social media and cable TV news, that kind of thing, I think they have. I mean it. When I say that, I mean that. It's cynical, right? What I'm saying is that people are so influenced by what's happening on a national level that they carry it has a disparate impact on local races, right? And I think that. And Tip O'Neill famously said all politics is local. And which is really a way of saying if you're Speaker of the House in Washington, D.C., you have to pay attention to the little guy, right, in your congressional district. That's what he means when he says all politics is local. But I think these national waves today really impact all races, and more and more, quite frankly. So, yeah, it's a cynical thing to say, but I believe that.
I would tell you I've got an autograph of Tip O'Neill's book from the Speaker. But
Man of the House, is that what it is? Yeah.
Yes. I couldn't I have the honor, by appointment from Mayor Hogsett, hardest working guy in Indianapolis, in my opinion, to be the president of the Metropolitan Development Commission. And those are real life situations on variances and zoning and economic incentives, and they affect neighborhoods. And there's no question in my mind, and I've always felt this way, that all politics is local. And when you're running a Metropolitan Development Commission meeting, I promise you, all politics are local, and you've got to get out. And Robert, I'm a visual person, so I'm not very smart to the uptake on going through stuff. I have to go to the site in the neighborhood. So everyone we vote on, I go there, and I walk the neighborhood, and I walk the site. And I think, Toby, I do that to get a feel for what somebody in Franklin Township saying versus Decatur Township versus Washington Township or Wayne. And I would tell you, in my opinion, in our community and statewide, all politics are really local, and how they affect people matters. So I believe you got to pay attention to it.
Toby, true or false, if Stephen Goldsmith had been elected governor in 96, you would have been the new mayor?
I think that in 1996, I spent several months campaigning to replace Steve Goldsmith as mayor. And my opponent in that race was, once again, J. Murray Clark. Right? Murray and I were both seeking that same position. And Murray and I were close friends before that and during that process, and we're still close friends. Right? And I think John Von Arx was in the race. Mm-hmm. So I think among John Von Arx, who at that time was the county auditor,
right,
and Murray and myself, I think one of the three of us would have replaced Steve. The process to replace Steve, so Steve had just been reelected as mayor in 95, ran for governor in 96, and so he would have had to vacate the office. The process was that the Republican precinct committeemen, of which there were about 800 at that time, and would have come together in a convention and voted. And I think it would have been a close race among Murray, John, and myself.
Did you expect Goldsmith to win that?
Yes, I did. I did. I actually so clearly remember on election night. I mean, the race was called about 7 o'clock in the evening. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. It was like I was driving to a campaign event, to replace Steve. And I'm driving there, and I thought, they called the race for Frank O'Bannon. And I turned around and went the other way. It's like, well, I'm not going to this event. It was a little bit shocking and disappointing, but it was a great process to go through.
Let me ask another question, because then I'm going to go right to you after this. Were you more surprised by Goldsmith's defeat in 96 for governor, or Bart Peterson's victory in 99 for Indianapolis mayor?
Well, I was more surprised by Steve losing in 96. In 1999, I think that there was sort of Bart Peterson ran a great race, and he came up with what he called the Peterson Plan. And I think John was involved in developing that. And the Peterson Plan was about a 200-page plan, but at the heart of it was he was going to hire 200 new police officers. And that had it was a great message. It had a dramatic impact on the electorate, and everywhere I went, I heard about the Peterson Plan. And so just to put this in perspective, so in 99, Bart ran against Sue Ann Gilroy. And Sue Ann was running for mayor, and I was one of the 4 at-large candidates. Mm-hmm. But it was pretty common throughout the time we had at-large counselors, for the most part, whoever won the mayor's race carried the 4 at-large council members. And I was one of those 4. And so when Bart won in 99, I lost the at-large race, which is a disappointment, but not a surprise. In fact, on election night, I went to a CYO football game instead of going to election headquarters, because I thought I just have a feeling that I'd rather be at a CYO football game than at Republican headquarters. So,
well, you might have not been surprised, but we were surprised
about 99.
About Toby losing.
Oh, okay.
But going back to when Mayor Goldsmith lost to Frank O'Bannon and Murray and Toby were positioning to be the next mayor, my position was, hey, they both love the city of Indianapolis. We win. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was no question in my mind, and they still do today. So
he came on the podcast. He was very gracious. He was interviewed by Jim Shella and me. Evan Bayh. John, talk a little bit about. I told Evan on the podcast that I remember my mother crying when Evan Bayh's mother died, and what was it like to work for him? How did you get to know him? You mentioned him like your mentor, and he came in 86 and then 88 and did very well. I don't know that anyone could say he was a terrible governor. He was a good governor, obviously.
Oh, I think he was an excellent governor. And my relationship with Evan really started to form as he got into the Secretary of State's race. Both not only with Evan, but I also had known Joe Hogsett back since 81, probably in that timeline. And
how did you meet Mayor Hogsett back then?
We actually had a double date back in those days. So how about that, Robert? And had hit it off right away. But I have the utmost respect and appreciation for Evan. We're dear friends today. I think the world of Joe Hogsett, and we're longtime friends. Evan may be the smartest political person I've ever met. I would even use the word brilliant. Had a vision far before anybody else had of where the country was going and where the state was going, and I never left him going thinking to myself, boy, I just learned something in that 1 hour meeting, and the same for Joe, by the way. Joe has a great vision, and those two. Joe's an interesting person. Joe is extremely bright, and Toby will tell you this as well. He's a true public servant. He doesn't care about making money. He doesn't care about, I think he will be concerned about his legacy down the road. But today, he doesn't worry about that stuff. He wants to do what's right. He wants to do what's right for the city. And he's always been that public servant attitude. And I appreciate that very much from him. But to close on Evan, Evan gave me opportunities at a young age that I never would have had. And I always will appreciate it.
How did you come to be the chief of staff for Mayor Peterson? That's when I really became, our friendship really kind of cemented itself.
Well, I was involved with Bart early on in his campaign. You have to ask Bart, but I bet I was in the top 3 of the people he came to see and said, hey, John, I'm going to run. And I said, I'm in. You probably don't remember this, but I was the chairman of the Indianapolis Bond Bank from day one and worked all the way through that and was very involved in the administration. And my relationship with Bart really started in the Bayh administration, and we became very close. And I have the utmost respect for Bart. Good friend, brilliant mind, and doesn't have a mean bone in his body, which may or may not be good in politics, but that certainly was his style. And I think everybody today appreciates the fact that the Peterson plan was laid out. Here's what I'm going to do, and he did it.
And he came on the podcast. Mayor Peterson did. He was a terrific guest. He gave O'Connor the credit for the Peterson plan, by the way.
Oh, he should have.
Mike O'Connor, another former Leaders and Legends podcast guest. When I interviewed Mayor Peterson, I said, look, we don't have to talk about 2007 in any degree. Like, we just want to mention it. I'm not going to sit there and grill you about it or anything like that, because he deserves respect. He brought it up in our podcast. I asked him, why did you run for a third term? He told me that the reason he ran was to protect charter schools, that was very, very important to him, and he just wasn't sure who was going to come after him would be as supportive. Turns out Mayor Ballard was incredibly supportive. But John, as someone who was in the room during that time, when do you think that 2007 started to go south?
It's very simple and very straightforward. And you're talking to Captain Edward Smith, the guy steering the Titanic into the iceberg, which I'll never get over, by the way, Robert. In July, we knew we were in trouble. And the problem was
reassessment.
The problem was the property tax issue was so hot.
Correct.
And people were so upset. And they didn't really blame the mayor, but they were kind of pointing to him as why.
They changed their attitude in general.
Then we made a calculated mistake, and I will tell you I was 100% against it, and I should have laid in front of his car before letting him run me over.
We're coming to the local option income tax.
It hooked into the property tax, and the people in Marion County go, are you guys not getting it? You arrogant people, are you not getting it? And I'm telling you, that was our demise. And in July, the numbers started going south, and you all were talking about 7 o'clock at night. Well, at 6:03, we knew the council was gone. And actually, Bart hung in there later in the evening, but couldn't get home. And
he was 1,500, 2,000 votes ahead most of the evening until the southern part of Marion County came in.
I agree 100%. And that's, in my opinion, humbly, that's exactly what happened and why he lost.
Because Mayor Ballard, when I worked for him, both as press secretary for the transition and his comms guy in the administration, would talk about crime a lot. And I would say, if they didn't raise the Lowit, you never would have won. And he's just like, oh, blah, blah. And, he's got some good points. I just said, look, I'm telling you, what happened was the property tax stuff started to halfway cool a little bit. I don't know exactly remember when Governor Daniels did 1, 2, 3. But when the local tax went up, that really re-energized the discontent, for lack of a better term.
John stated it perfectly. It connected back the responsibility for the reassessment. Bart Peterson had nothing to do with the reassessment, right? That was a process that started 12 years before on a state level and was debated, about greater connection between property tax value and assessed value, right? Real value versus assessed value, right? And so that process had been going on for years. The mayor had nothing to do with it. But when the local option income tax was increased, there was a connection made, and it was an interesting process because as I recall, I don't think Mayor Ballard ran much TV if
he didn't have any money.
He had raised $250,000. God love him.
His TV. He may have run a few ads the last few days, but for the most part, I first realized that the mayor was in trouble 2 weeks before the election.
Mayor Peterson,
when he started running these negative ads against Ballard, and I thought, why is he running negative ads against Ballard? And I just realized, numbers must be bad.
The only meeting during the transition period between Mayor Peterson and Mayor Ballard was up on the 25th floor in the mayor's office conference room. I was lucky enough to be in that meeting. And I walk in with the mayor, and Joe Loftus was there, and John Cochran. The first person I see when I walk in the sort of like reception room for the mayor's office is your friend John Dillon. His big paw reaches out and says, hey, I need to talk to you. And we talked for a couple minutes, and John could not have been more gracious. I know it hurt. I told Mayor Ballard over Thanksgiving weekend when he called me because he's writing a book about his time as mayor. I said, I still can't believe you won the first time, let alone that you're writing a book. He goes, Robert, it's been 15 years. I'm like, I don't care. It's absolutely shocking to me. But John was, as Bart Peterson's chief of staff, he was kind, he was cordial. He brought me aside and go, Robert, we're all stunned, but we think you're going to do a good job. And I told John, I said, if you need anything, you call me.
So, Robert, let me just follow it up with a story. In 1999, I told you I lost that race for re-election. When Bart was first elected, he beat Sue Ann Gilroy, and I was swept out in that. I couldn't really sleep very well that night. I got up about 5 in the morning, drove to my office, and about 7:30, our receptionist was already here, and she called and said, "You have a visitor." And I went out. There's John Dillon standing in the lobby, and he said exactly the same things. It must be a standard speech that he has, but it was, no,
Did you learn that at DePaul?
no, but it was, in all seriousness, it was just a level of respect for an opponent, right? And he just said, "I'm sorry you lost, and let me know if I can do anything to help." And I will always be appreciative.
But that's the part I was making earlier, and I have one more question, then we'll go to the 5 questions with which we end all of our podcasts. You're listening to Leaders and Legends. Our guests are longtime friends, John Dillon and Toby McClamroch. I saw John Gregg literally right outside your building after he lost in 2016 to Eric Holcomb, now Governor Holcomb. We chatted for a minute, and the last question I asked him, I said, John, or Speaker Gregg probably, forgive me for asking, but have you heard from the new vice president yet about your election, meaning Pence? And he said he called me on Thursday. 2 days after the election, Gregg says that, and what I didn't know until John Gregg came on the podcast, is that John Gregg's radio gig happened because Mike Pence hired him. And so it leads to my question. Matt Tully and I once got into, rest your soul, Matt, a fun argument about why can't R's and D's get along. My response was, Matt, the real feuds are within the parties. It's R's against R's and D's against D's. Am I right or wrong? And do you have an example of how you felt it or seen it? Toby?
Well, sure. I think that intra-party squabbles are much more intense, right? Because the reason that we have this, we have 2 parties is so that we can argue, right? So that we can disagree, be opponents, right? It's a dialectic that works for us to make decisions, right? But within parties, you don't have that same kind of system. You're not expected to be opponents, right? And so I don't know that I have a good example.
Well, there's still the fallout from the Gilroy mayoral campaign lasted for years. That's what I've always been told.
I wouldn't know anything about that, Robert.
Let's just say, Toby.
I wouldn't either.
Say, Toby, you're lucky we don't post any video for this podcast. It's just the audio.
No, by the way, I want to be clear. I was a big proponent of Sue Ann Gilroy. I mean, we actually grew up near each other, right? And so I'd known Sue Ann, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for her. I mean, look, whenever you lose, right, they're just disappointment, right? But that doesn't, I'm not so sure there was fallout as much as, we were just disappointed we lost, right? More than anything else.
John?
I think you've got to control by working together on inter-party politics. You got to remember, in my era, we've always been in the minority in the state, in the city. So I think that brought people closest together. We were fortunate to have a great leader in Evan Bayh, great leaders in Joe Hogsett, and they kind of saw the vision. And sure, are there going to be squabbles because people are trying to position to move forward? But I think we get over those for the most part and are capable of moving forward.
So let me ask a question, because you each have the same issue, just differentiated by geography. John, how did the Democrats become more competitive statewide? And then Toby, how do Republicans become more competitive Marion County-wide? John?
It is a question, Robert, that I've been in several sessions on, and we don't have an answer at this point. We need a new generation with a new vision, one that appeals more to the right, but has the ability to bring the left farther with it toward the middle. And we don't have it yet. We're working on it. So I'll just be blunt. We don't have the answer to the statewide issue.
You got an answer for me, Toby, about our
do.
Party here in Marion County?
I do. I think all politics are national. And I think for the Republican Party to be successful in Marion County, the Republican Party nationally needs to move on from the last 4 years, the last 6 years, or whatever. We need to move on from Donald Trump. We need to go a different direction. Somebody that supports the rule of law, somebody that's really committed to Republican principles. And I think by doing that, what will happen is we'll attract independent voters to the Republican Party. So, yeah, I mean, I think that I'm hopeful that as we head to 2024 and we find new leadership, I think it'll help us in Marion County. You know, I think we would all agree that the Marion County prosecutor's race last year was really a bellwether for how we're positioned in Marion County and Indianapolis. But I think that I don't think we need to lose hope, right? I think we have, but we really have to get ourselves well positioned on a national basis.
Because in '88, you really had a once-in-a-lifetime candidate statewide in Evan Bayh. But in 2007 in Marion County, you had kind of a once-in-a-lifetime issue. So it can come either way. It could be issue-based or it could be personality-based for the fortunes to change.
I really do think, though, and Toby, I think you would agree with me, that the Stu Dillons, Bob Dillon, Jack Dillon, Billy Mack, Bo Bayh, Nick Bayh, that generation, and they're all talking about it or trying to figure out a new approach that works with modern society, because old dogs like me just probably don't get it, and they've got to figure it out. So
we've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. It's going to be an honor to pose these. So we'll do Toby first, since you're older, and then you, but you can just answer the same question. And Toby, remind me, I have a favor to ask you. My son just got accepted into law school.
Congratulations.
Great.
Thank you very, very much.
Where at? Which school?
Downtown, McKinney.
Good. Fantastic.
Yeah. But I'll ask a favor if you could just chat with him. Anyway.
Sure.
So, 5 questions. What was your first job?
My first job was in high school. I worked in retail for a clothing store called Paul Harris, which was pretty well known around Indianapolis. But they had a small shop in Crawfordsville, and I worked there at night. You know, I went to school, and then I'd always have football or basketball or track practice, and then after that I'd go work there from 6 to 9. So, but keep in mind, I grew up on a farm, right? And so from the earliest age, I was working on the farm, doing a lot of things that you do on a farm, right? Because this was a working farm, right? This wasn't just some gentleman farm setup. This is my dad farmed, and so I was always active on the farm. But my first where I got it paid was working for Paul Harris.
John?
I was a field representative for Rockwood Insurance Company of Indiana, and I traveled the entire state every single day in every nook and cranny.
What was your first concert, Toby?
Well, you're gonna laugh when I say this. I actually remember when I was very young going to see Roy Rogers and Dale Evans at the State Fair, and then I also remember right after that, when I was very young, seeing Tennessee Ernie Ford at the State Fair.
So you grew up on a farm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I've always loved country music, but I've Dale Evans and Roy Rogers, I don't really remember being there, but what I do, I very clearly remember seeing Tennessee Ernie Ford. I was probably 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, right in there.
What was the first concert you actually purchased your own ticket?
Well, my father was always involved in the State Fair, and so we always got free tickets all the way through college to concerts at the State Fair. I mean, I suppose after I got married well into the 80s, I had to start paying for tickets. Probably George Strait would be my first concert that I bought a ticket for.
73 or 74, Indiana State Fair, the smoking hot Olivia Newton-John was my first concert. And the first ticket I ever bought, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, was for the Jackson 5. I followed them, so.
I met the Jackson 5.
Did you really?
I did.
All 5?
All 5. I have a photograph with the Jackson 5. It's one of my treasures.
Oh, my gosh.
My childhood.
And I have a photograph with Olivia Newton-John.
Do you really?
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather have the Jackson 5.
I'm with my Democrat friend.
I'll stay with Olivia Newton-John on that.
Question number 3, Toby, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I think Team of Rivals. I think that Team of Rivals captured. It's about Abraham Lincoln and the cabinet that he developed, and so he because what it does, it really covers a lot of the things that we're talking about today in terms of how you respect people. And I mean, he essentially took the people that had run against him in the primary and put him in his cabinet, and it's one of his secrets to success because he had the confidence in himself to be able to do that. It's also a history of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, which are just incredibly important to understand in terms of understanding our country and where we are.
True.
I'm not that serious, Tobin. I'm a John Grisham fan, so Time to Kill is kind of my favorite, and The Firm and Pelican Brief. I have not read, but it's sitting on my chair, is The Boys from Biloxi. I haven't read it yet, but he just put that out. But I, for whatever reason, enjoy his books.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Boy, that's difficult. Robert, I have to think about this. I mean, I think that I'd probably go back to from a historic standpoint. I've always been fascinated by the time of Teddy Roosevelt and the transformation that we went through as a country, and Teddy Roosevelt's leadership in really making us a modern country, right? Bringing us out of the backroom kind of approach to politics and creating more of a retail approach and the will of the people and reforming Washington, D.C. And so I've always been fascinated. I think it'd be interesting to have lived through that period.
Would you have wanted to be there when he got shot in the middle of his speech and then finished his speech?
He did finish the speech. I mean, he was a larger-than-life person by any stretch, right? He finished his term and then he went to Africa for 2 years. Robert, you'd know better than I would. I mean, he was just a larger-than-life person that I would have enjoyed watching, living through that.
And he received the Medal of Honor. And his son, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., received the Medal of Honor for his actions on D-Day. So, incredible family on both sides. John, any event in history?
It's a tie between the inauguration of John Kennedy and the American invasion into Europe. I would have liked to have been there to watch that, been a part of it.
The last question, and you can answer each other, by the way. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
So I'm first.
Yes, sir.
Bob Dillon.
Bob Dillon? No relation to John Dillon?
I'm sorry. Not his Bob Dylan.
I was going to say this. I got to meet this kid.
The most recent winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, Bob Dylan.
That's a good one.
John?
Well, I thought you might ask who I'd want to have dinner with who was deceased. I don't get to answer that.
Well,
I will. It's my father. I would love to have a dinner with him for 2 hours. You're going to find this answer different. I would love to look Putin in the eye and say, man, what are you thinking? I don't
what
understand.
answer are you going to get?
I don't know. But I'm
You've been dealing with politicians all your life.
I'd be very interested to hear what's going through his mind and where he's coming from.
John, here's your chance to say one more nice thing about Toby.
Oh, dear friend, fantastic family, heart and soul of Montgomery County, and do anything for me.
Toby, here's another chance to say something nice about John Dillon.
Well, great family, right, to start with. I mean, 3 boys, great wife. I knew his wife, Ann Trudgeon. I remember her at DePaul, star tennis player, right? But he's got like this model family, these 3 boys with Jack, Bob, and Stu. But when I think about John Dillon, I think about loyalty, right? I mean, John is just an incredibly loyal person who watches out for his friends. And as a result of that, John Dillon has dozens of friends. I mean, dozens. When I referred to him as his posse a few minutes ago, the interesting thing about John is John has a Brebeuf posse. He has a DePaul posse. He has a posse from his time at the State House, one from his time at the City County building. I mean, so seriously, I mean, he just elicits loyalty or quite frankly, respect because of his loyalty to other people.
You're very kind, Toby.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends, LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guests today have been good friends for decades, Toby McClamroch and John Dillon. Thank you both so much for coming on the podcast, and hopefully the listeners will take away that politics, whether it's national or local, doesn't have to be divisive.
Thank you, Robert, for having us.
Yeah, Robert, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.